There's a house in Albemarle County, Virginia that no longer exists. The foundation stones were torn up in 1847, scattered across the property like someone was trying to erase what happened there. Local records from the period mention a plantation owner named Edmund Hartwell, but his name disappears from county documents after 1836. What remains are 3 marriage contracts filed in different carouses, each one stranger than the last. 3 daughters, 3 business partners, 3 transactions that weren't called sales, but everyone knew what they were. This is the story of a man who turned his own children into currency and a system that looked the other way because it was legal, profitable, and disturbingly common. Hello, everyone. Before we start, make sure to like and subscribe to the channel and leave a comment with where you're from and what time you're watching. That way, YouTube will keep showing you stories just like this one. Edmund Hartwell wasn't poor. That's what makes this worse. He owned 600 acres of tobacco land, 23 enslaved people, and held shares in 3 mercantile operations stretching from Richmond to Charleston. His wealth wasn't in question. His daughters were 16, 14, and 12 years old in 1835, and their futures should have been secure. But Edmund had a problem that wealth couldn't fix. He was a gambler, not with cards, but with land speculation and cotton futures. He'd borrowed heavily against projected yields that never materialized, and by the spring of that year, 3 of his business partners held notes that could destroy him. The man's names were William Cunningham, age 41, a widower, Thomas Ashford, age 37, never married, and Jacob Priest, age 49, whose first wife had died in childbirth. These weren't strangers. They'd sat at Edmund's table. They'd stayed in his home. They knew his daughters by name. The first proposal came in April. William Cunningham arrived at the Hartwell estate with a leather folder containing Edmund's outstanding debts, nearly $4,000, a sum that would take a decade to repay. He sat across from Edmund in the study and made an offer that was documented years later in a private letter discovered in the Cunningham family papers. He would forgive the entire debt in exchange for marriage to Edmund's eldest daughter, Carolyn. Not a courtship, not a betrothal with time to consider. A transaction to be finalized within 6 weeks. Carolyn was 16. She'd never been courted. She didn't know the meeting was happening until her father called her into the room and told her the arrangement had been made. Carolyn Hartwell's diary survived. It's housed now in a private collection, rarely seen, but excerpts were published in a historical journal in 1903, then quickly suppressed by descendants who didn't want the story told. Her entry from April 19, 1835 is 4 sentences long. Father says I am to marry Mr. Cunningham before summer. Mother will not look at me. I asked if I had a choice, and father said a daughter's duty is obedience, and that I should be grateful for a husband of such standing. I am not grateful. The wedding took place on May 30th at the Hartwell estate. 47 guests attended. Carolyn wore her mother's wedding dress, altered to fit. In the marriage portrait painted a week later, her face is blank, her eyes focused somewhere beyond the frame. William Cunningham stands beside her with his hand on her shoulder, fingers pressed into the fabric of her dress. She looks like she's holding her breath. But Edmund's problems weren't solved. The wedding erased 1 debt, but 2 remained, and by June, Thomas Ashford was making inquiries about the second daughter. Her name was Margaret, called Maggie by the family. She was 14 years old, and according to a letter written by a cousin, she'd been promised since childhood to a boy from a neighboring family, a quiet arrangement between parents who thought their children suited each other. That promise meant nothing now. Thomas Ashford held $2,200 in promissory notes, and he wanted a wife young enough to give him children compliant enough not to question his authority. Edmund called Maggie into his study in July. The same room, the same conversation, the same outcome. She cried according to a household servant's testimony given decades later, but her father told her tears were a luxury they could no longer afford. The wedding was set for August. What's disturbing isn't just that it had penned, it's how smoothly it happened. There was no scandal, no intervention. The church blessed the union. The county clerk recorded the marriage without comment. Margaret Ashford, formerly Hartwell, moved into her husband's home 3 days after the ceremony. and was never seen in public without him again. Letters from that period, written by women in the community, mentioned the marriages in passing, the way you'd mention weather or crop yields. One woman wrote to her sister in Richmond, "The Hartwell girls have married well, though quickly. Edmund must be relieved." Relieved, that was the word she used. The third daughter was 12 years old. Her name was Anna, and she should have had years before anyone even spoke of marriage. But Jacob Priest was waiting, and he held the largest debt of all, $3,200, with interest accumulating monthly. By September, Edmund had no assets left to liquidate, no land he could sell without losing the plantation itself. He had one remaining piece of leverage, and Jacob Priest had made his intentions clear. The problem was the law. Virginia statutes in 1835 set the minimum age for marriage at 12 for girls, but required parental consent and in some counties a magistrate's review for anyone under 14. Edmund needed to wait until Anna's 12th birthday in October. He waited exactly one day after. The marriage license was filed on October 18, 1835. Anna Hartwell married Jacob Priest, a man 37 years her senior, in a private ceremony with no guests outside the immediate families. There's a court record from 1842, 7 years later, that mentions Anna Priest in the context of a property dispute. She would have been 19. The language in the document is called administrative, but there's a detail that stands out. It notes that Anna Priest had borne 4 children by that time, which means her first pregnancy began when she was 13 years old, possibly 12. The record lists 3 surviving children and 1 infant death. It does not mention her health. It does not mention whether she had any say in any of it. Jacob Priest lived to be 68 years old. Anna was 43 when he died, having spent 31 years as his wife. She never remarried. She never left Virginia. In the one photograph that exists of her taken in the 1860s, her face is weathered beyond her years, her expression unreadable. What happened to Edmund Hartwell after he traded his daughters for solvency? He prospered. That's the part that makes you want to close the book and walk away, but you can't because it's true. With his debts cleared, he reinvested in land, expanded his operations, and by 1840 was one of the wealthier planters in Albemarle County. He served on the county board. He donated to the church. In local histories from the period, he's described as a respected businessman and father. They still called him that. His wife, Elizabeth, left no written record of her thoughts, but a neighbor's diary from 1837 mentions seeing her at a church social, sitting alone, speaking to no one. The entry says, Elizabeth Hartwell looked like a woman in mourning, though no one in her family had died. The marriages weren't unusual. That's the truth that sits heavy when you dig into the records from this period. What Edmund Hartwell did to his daughters wasn't an anomaly or the act of one cruel man operating outside the boundaries of society. It was the system working exactly as designed. In Virginia in the 1830s, daughters were assets. Their marriages were negotiations. Their consent was a formality, often not even required. Financial arrangements between fathers and prospective husbands were standard practice documented in family ledgers alongside livestock purchases and land transactions. The difference with the Hartwell case is how transparent it was, how quickly it happened, and how young the girls were. But the underlying mechanism, the idea that a daughter could settle a debt, secure a business partnership, or consolidate family wealth through marriage, that was everywhere. Court records from the period are full of these transactions, though most families had the discretion to disguise them as normal courtships. A farmer in Augusta County married his 15-year-old daughter to his creditor in 1833. A merchant in Norfolk arranged marriages for both his daughters to business associates in exchange for shares in a shipping company. These weren't crimes. They were contracts enforced by law and sanctioned by society. The girls involved rarely appear in the records by name. They're listed as daughter of their identities subsumed into their father's estates and then their husbands' households. If they objected, if they refused, if they ran, there's no record of it because there was no legal framework for their refusal to matter. A father's authority was absolute and the daughter's obedience was compulsory. What did Carolyn, Margaret, and Anna know about the men they were given to? Carolyn's husband, William Cunningham, who had a reputation in Richmond business CRO as ruthless and litigious. He'd been involved in 3 lawsuits over broken contracts, and in each case he'd won by outlasting his opponents financially. Margaret's husband, Thomas Ashford, was known for his temper. A letter from a former employee describes him as a man who did not tolerate disagreement and expected absolute difference from everyone in his household. Jacob Priest, Anna's husband, had been married before, and his first wife's death was attributed to complications from childbirth. But a midwife's account from years later suggested the woman had been in declining health for months and had been denied medical care because Jacob considered doctors an unnecessary expense. These were the men Edmund Hartwell chose. These were the men he entrusted with his daughters' lives. There's a letter that survived, written in 1839, 4 years after the marriages. It was found in a trunk of family correspondence auctioned off in 1921. And it's from Carolyn to her younger sister Margaret. The letter is careful, almost coded, the way women of that era learned to write when they knew their husbands might read their mail. Carolyn asks about Margaret's health, mentions that she herself has been unwell, and then writes this: "I wonder sometimes what our lives might have been if we had been born sons, or if father had been a different kind of man. But there is no use in wondering. We are where we are, and we must make our peace with it, or go mad trying to fight what cannot be changed." The letter ends with a postscript: "Do you ever see Anna? I have written to her twice with no reply. I worry." There's no record of Margaret's response and no evidence that Carolyn ever heard from Anna again. The silence around Anna is the most disturbing part of this story. After her marriage in 1835, she vanishes from family correspondence almost entirely. She's mentioned in legal documents when necessary, listed in census records as part of Jacob Priest's household. But her voice, her perspective, her existence as a person separate from her husband, that's gone. Carolyn and Margaret at least left fragments, letters, diary entries, mentions in other people's accounts. Anna left nothing, whether that's because she had no opportunity to write, no literacy, no access to paper and ink, or because everything she did write was destroyed. We'll never know. What we do know is that she was 12 years old when her father sold her future, and by the time she was 19, she'd already had 4 pregnancies. The math is brutal. The implications are worse. If you're still watching, you're already braver than most. Tell us in the comments, what would you have done if this was your bloodline? Would you even want to know? Edmund Hartwell died in 1851 at the age of 63. His obituary in the local paper praised his business acumen, his service to the community, and his devotion to family. It mentioned his 3 daughters only in passing, listing them by their married names. There's no record of any of them attending his funeral. His estate was divided among his sons and male relatives. His daughters received nothing, which was standard practice since married women had no legal right to inherit property. Everything they might have been owed went directly to their husbands. Even in death, Edmund maintained control, ensuring that the men who had paid for his daughters with forgiven debts would profit from his legacy. The house was destroyed in 1847, 4 years before Edmund's death, but he wasn't living there when it happened. He'd moved to a smaller property closer to town, claiming the old estate was too costly to maintain. But there's another version of the story whispered in family letters and mentioned once in a County Historical Society newsletter from 1894. The house was torn down because Elizabeth Hartwell demanded it. She lived there through the marriages, through the silence that followed, through the years of watching her daughters disappear into lives she couldn't protect them from. And according to one account, she told Edmund she wouldn't spend another night under that roof, that the walls themselves were poisoned by what he'd done. Whether that's true or embellished by time, the outcome is the same. The house came down, the stones were scattered, and the family never spoke of it publicly again. Elizabeth died in 1849, 2 years before her husband. There's a gravestone in the family plot, simple and unadorned, with just her name and dates. No epitaph, no mention of her as a beloved wife or devoted mother, which was standard for women of her class and era, just the facts of her existence: born, lived, died. A church record from her funeral notes that only a few people attended, and that her daughters were not among them. Whether they weren't invited, couldn't travel, or chose not to come. The record doesn't say, but the absence is loud. 3 daughters, none of them there to bury their mother. You have to wonder what words were left unsaid, what grief had calcified into something else entirely, something too heavy to carry into church. William Cunningham outlived Carolyn. She died in 1858 at the age of 39. The cause of death listed in the family Bible is consumption, which could mean tuberculosis or could mean anything the family didn't want to name. She'd been married to him for 23 years. There were no children, which was unusual enough that people remarked on it in letters. One relative speculated that perhaps God had spared her the burden of motherhood given the circumstances of her marriage. Another wrote more bluntly, Carolyn never wanted any of it, and perhaps her body knew. Thomas Ashford died in 1861, and Margaret outlived him by 30 years, dying in 1891 at the age of 70. Those 3 decades without him were the longest period of her adult life, where she belonged to herself. She never remarried. She lived quietly in the same house, managing the property he left her, and according to one account, she burned every letter, every document, every photograph of him the week after his funeral. Anna lived the longest. She died in 1896 at the age of 73, having survived all of them: her father, her mother, her sisters, her husband, and most of her children. There's a brief obituary in the county paper, 3 sentences long, describing her as the widow of Jacob Priest and a longtime resident of the area. It says nothing about who she was before she became his wife, nothing about the fact that she was 12 years old when her childhood ended. In the decades after Jacob's death, Anna lived alone in a small house on the edge of the property. Neighbors described her as reclusive, polite, but distant. A woman who kept to herself and rarely spoke about the past. One neighbor interviewed in 1932 for a local history project remembered her as haunted, like she was still living in a time the rest of us had moved on from. The Hartwell name faded from prominence after Edmund's death. His sons didn't carry on the business with the same success, and by the 1870s the family holdings had been sold off piece by piece. The plantation land is farmland now, divided among several owners, none of them named Hartwell. There's no historic marker, no mention in local tourist materials, nothing to indicate what happened there. The County Historical Society has a file on the family, but it's thin, and most of the documents focus on Edmund's business dealings and land acquisitions. The marriages are mentioned in a footnote listed as arranged unions common to the period with no further details. It's as if the whole thing has been smoothed over, filed away under. That's just how things were, as if that explanation absolves anyone of anything. But the records exist. The marriage licenses, the debt forgiveness agreements, the letters, the diary entries, the court documents. They exist because someone kept them, filed them, archived them, even when it would have been easier to let them disappear. And they tell a story that a lot of people would prefer to forget, that the past wasn't just difficult or complicated, it was deliberately cruel in ways that were perfectly legal, that fathers could sacrifice their daughters and be praised for their pragmatism, that men could purchase wives the way they purchased land and livestock, and society would bless the transaction, that girls could be 12 years old and considered old enough to be handed over to middle-aged men. And no one with the power to stop it thought there was anything wrong. What happened to the Hartwell daughters wasn't rare. It wasn't an outlier. It was the machine working as intended, grinding through lives and leaving behind just enough documentation that we can pretend we don't know. Carolyn, Margaret, and Anna weren't characters in a cautionary tale. They were real. They lived through this. And the worst part is that their story isn't even the worst one. For every case like theirs where some record survived, there are dozens more where the evidence was destroyed, the names were forgotten, and the girls just disappeared into marriages that erased them. This is the history we inherited, not the version in textbooks that skips over the uncomfortable parts, but the real one. The one that shows what people were willing to do to each other when the law said it was allowed. The house in Albemarle County is gone. The family is scattered, but the weight of what happened there, that doesn't go anywhere. Please subscribe to my YouTube channel and like.